Hello all. Today we're going to talk about some background information for the play Andromache, also written by Euripides, the author of Iphigenia et Aulis. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so we're going to go ahead and jump in. The first thing we're going to talk about are the many marriages of the play Andromache, and I'll give you a few hints as to why they're important for understanding this play. So the first is the marriage between Peleus and Thetis, and this marriage we've made reference to previously for Iphigenia et Aulis. So remember, Peleus is a mortal and Thetis is a goddess. She's a sea goddess, also sometimes called a Nereid. And it's at this marriage that the judgment of Paris is first created, because the goddess Discord throws this apple into the wedding, and all of the goddesses claim that they are the most beautiful, and Zeus orders that the judgment be made by Paris, the shepherd and kind of bumbling mortal who falls into this conflict among the gods. When Paris chooses Aphrodite as the most beautiful, he's awarded Helen as his prize, and that becomes the cause of the war. In this play, we want to remember that Peleus is acting here as the grandfather to Neoptolemus, and Thetis is a goddess whose temple Andromache is basically seeking refuge in. So Peleus and Thetis, again, these are Achilles' parents, and so that's always in the background as well. Menelaus and Helen, now we've talked about their marriage in both of the plays that we've read before, both its dissolution as Helen runs away or is taken away by Paris over to Troy, which again is considered one of the causes of the Trojan War. But we want to bear in mind too that at the end of the Trojan War, as we'll see momentarily, Helen is returned to Menelaus and they go back to Sparta to resume their married life. So that marriage is also in the background of a lot of the discussions that goes on in Andromache. Perhaps the most important marriage, though, is the marriage between Andromache and Hector. And this is what our image here is referring to. This is a painting by Giorgio di Chirico. It was painted around 1900, depicting the relationship between Hector and Andromache. Now remember, Andromache and Hector are Trojans. Hector is the first son of Priam. He is the foremost Trojan warrior and is considered sort of the crown prince of Troy. When Priam dies, he'll become the next king. Andromache is from a neighboring city. She marries Hector before the war, and they have a son together. So Hector and Andromache are basically like the prince and princess of Troy, and their son Astyanax is considered the young prince who would be next in line after Hector. And their marriage is often depicted as one of mutual admiration and respect and love. So their marriage is often held up as a model, something that people should aspire to, that reflects all of the best values and all of the best qualities of a successful marriage in this time. Now, in contrast, Neoptolemus and Hermione's marriage, which is very closely scrutinized in our play, is almost the opposite, where Hermione in particular expresses how marginalized and how disrespected she feels in their marriage. Now, Neoptolemus is the son of Achilles. Hermione is the daughter of Menelaus and Helen, and she was born before the war began. This marriage between them would have been considered a very successful one. Remember, fathers contract these marriages in order to build political alliances and keep wealth and power within their families. So Neoptolemus as the son of Achilles and Hermione as the daughter of as the daughter of Menelaus would have been considered a successful match. But personally, it isn't as successful. So we'll look at some of that when we talk about the play itself. All right, the other thing that we need to talk about is the actual end of the Trojan War. So we've been discussing the Trojan War obliquely in the sense that it's always out there in the plays that we've read. We're either leading up to the war or we're alluding to what happens after the war, but we haven't really talked about the war itself. What we'll get to today is actually the end of the war. So the war itself has been characterized by a long siege of the city of Troy. There have been many attempts by the Greeks to get into the city, and because it has very strong walls, they've never been able to penetrate the city. At the end of the war, one of the very wily, very smart Greek warriors named Odysseus comes up with a plan to sneak the Greeks into the city by deceit by creating a giant wooden horse. You might have heard of the Trojan horse before. Creating a giant wooden horse that the men can hide in, and that will be left for the Trojans as a gift. So when the Trojans bring this horse into the city, thinking that it means that the Greeks have left and they've left a gift to their goddesses to basically beg for a safe trip home, that night the Greeks sneak out of the horse and open the gates so that all of the Greeks can come in and destroy the city. So that's where we are at the end, and there are a few major sort of components that we need to think about. First are the deaths of Hector and Achilles, which happened before the siege, the end of the siege, but are really critical for Andromache. In this bottom image here, we see Achilles and Hector after their one-on-one battle. Achilles kills Hector and ties him to his chariot and drags him away to the Greek army, or to the Greek army base. Now this is really critical because remember last time when we talked about Iphigenia at Aulis and Agamemnon, we mentioned that not being able to bury your dead was very dangerous, because not being able to complete the rituals of the dead meant that the souls of the dead were not able to complete their journey into the underworld. So Achilles dragging Hector away was very difficult emotionally, of course, but there's also this element of this danger for Hector's soul, essentially, not being able to cross over. Achilles is later killed by Paris, Helen's Trojan husband, and that leaves a gap in the forces of the Greeks that many different warriors come to fill. You know, they want to take on this role as most powerful Greek warrior. One of those soldiers who comes to fill that role is Achilles' own son, Neoptolemus. So he comes to Troy after his father is dead and becomes one of these really important and really famous Greek warriors as well. I've already alluded to the invasion and the destruction of the city of Troy in the course of the end. And I also wanted to remind you that Helen herself is returned to Menelaus as things go. Now what I'm showing you up top here is the death of Priam. So Neoptolemus, even though he is a very famous warrior, comes to get the reputation of being incredibly brutal and incredibly sacrilegious as he takes over and really makes a name for himself in the destruction of Troy. The image that you're seeing here is Neoptolemus. You can see his helmet killing Priam, the king of Troy, and you can see his white beard and his white hair on an altar. So Priam and the family, his Trojan family, had gone into a sanctuary to essentially seek protection from the gods, and Neoptolemus follows them in and kills him on the altar. So this is incredibly sacrilegious and also very harrowing. You can see women who are standing around watching this happen, kind of grabbing their hair, and that's one of those signs of mourning that we've talked about previously for how women show that they're distraught or distressed. So Neoptolemus gains a reputation for being excessively cruel, which will follow him into our play as well. Another thing we need to bear in mind, after the end of the Trojan War, Priam is killed, Hector is already dead, many of the other Trojan men are dead. Once the city itself is destroyed, the spoils of the city, all of the property, all of the goods that the Trojans had, are divided up among the Greeks. And among that property is the Trojan women, all right, the family of Priam. And the women are given to the warriors as gifts or as prizes, signs of their own warrior prowess. And they're taken back to Greece as captives. So this is just a very quick rundown of who winds up with whom. Hecuba, who is the queen and the wife of Priam, goes with Odysseus. Cassandra, who is one of Priam's daughters, winds up with Agamemnon, and we know how that turns out from our previous play. Andromache, the wife of Hector, goes with Neoptolemus, and that's the play we're reading today. And then there's another daughter, Polyxena, who is actually sacrificed at Troy as a gift to Achilles' ghost. So that's what we're looking at here. You can see Diomedes. You can see these little names that are incised so we know who is who. Diomedes is a Greek warrior who's slitting Polyxena's throat over an altar and over a fire so that Achilles' ghost may be appeased. So you can remember the sacrifice of Iphigenia that begins the war, and we have another sacrifice of another young woman at the end of the war as well. Okay, so a little bit of historic perspective about slaves and concubines. So this is Andromache's situation. The image that we're looking at here is called Captive Andromache by Frederick Leighton from 1888. And this was a motif and an important phase of Andromache's story. One of the things that she's most famous for in Greek mythology is being a representation of mourning because of the love that she had for her husband Hector. But what we need to keep in mind, and this is what Andromache really elaborates on, is that when these women were taken away, right, when they're taken as a slave into their captors' homes, they're usually leaving their homeland, right? They're moving to a place where they don't speak the language and they don't speak the culture, and they're installed as members of this household. And normally, they're households of the men who killed their family, right? So in the case of the captives, all of their male relatives are dead. They would have been killed in the war. So there's no protector remaining for them. They're really at the mercy of the victors. Their male children are often considered threats and killed as part of the destruction of the city. So remember that Hector and Andromache had a son named Astyanax, who was considered sort of the heir apparent for the throne of Troy. Neoptolemus also kills Astyanax during the destruction of the city by throwing him off of the walls of Troy. So Andromache sees her husband killed, she sees her father-in-law killed, she sees her son killed, and now she's going to be forced to go to Troy with these people who she has watched killed. Not to Troy, but go to Greece with the men she has seen kill her family. Now, going with Neoptolemus is extra difficult because Neoptolemus is the son of Achilles. And remember, Achilles kills not only her husband, Hector, but even earlier in the war, Achilles kills her father and her brothers as well. So Andromache has seen a lot of death at the hands of this family, Peleus's family, his son Achilles, and his grandson Neoptolemus. So what these women, so not just Andromache, but of course she's kind of symbolically represents these women, but what they could expect when they moved to this new home, so to say. They would be in charge of housework, weaving, childcare, the very basic stuff that most women would have been entrusted to in the family. But again, this is somebody else's home and somebody else's children that they would be working with. For women, they would often be compelled or forced to have sex with their captor. So as members of the household and as slaves, the male masters would have considered the women their property and theirs to do whatever they wanted to do with. So sex, even if it wasn't wanted or non-consensual, sex with the captor was pretty much considered par for the course. This would have happened. And that would lead to bearing children. So again, not that they would have wanted to do this necessarily or would have had any sort of say, but, sex with your captor would most certainly result in the bearing of children and putting children in a somewhat awkward position because they're not necessarily legitimate children of the master, right? Because this would have been a child outside of the bonds of marriage. But it is still a child, and depending on who the master is, they might feel affection for this kid. So one of the interesting things, and this is one of the central conflicts of our play, is that men could have both a wife and a concubine, right? The slave that a master regularly sleeps with. And as this might seem fine for the master, but complicated for the women. So this is one of the main areas of conflict of the play. Neoptolemus has both a legal wife and a concubine who has already borne him a child. and this is how we're going to see some difficulties playing out. Okay, enjoy the play.